The strange thing about ancient flood stories is not that they speak of water. Rivers flood, seas rise, storms erase villages. The colder question is why so many cultures turned loss into memory and memory into sacred text. Maybe no single wave crossed the whole world, but something in human history learned to fear the same ending: ground becoming water, home becoming silence. The ancient texts that describe the same flood did everyone remember one disaster. The first puzzle is simple enough to hold in the mind at night. Water is ordinary. It falls from the sky, gathers in streams, fills riverbeds, and returns with the seasons. No early community needed a priest, a poet, or a carved tablet to know that water could feed a field. Yet in many old traditions, water does not remain ordinary. It becomes the border between one world and another. It becomes the thing that comes before a new beginning. It washes over cities, families, animals, names, and memory itself, until the story is no longer only about weather. It becomes a way of asking why life survives at all when the ground beneath it can disappear. That is the quiet paradox behind ancient flood stories. They may begin with rivers and storms, but they often grow into something larger, a memory of human smallness in front of a force no hand could hold back. For the earliest people who settled close to water, this was not an abstract fear. Human life has always depended on water more deeply than almost any other element. The body needs it. Food depends on it. Animals follow it. Plants rise from it. The first stable communities, in many parts of the world, formed where water could be reached again and again. A river valley, a lake shore, a marsh edge, or a low coastal plain could offer fish, birds, soft soil, reeds, clay, and routes of travel. These were places where the body could rest, where children could be fed, and where a group might recognize a home by repeated return. But the same place that gives life can also take it away. A river that leaves silt for crops can rise beyond its banks. A coast that offers shellfish and movement can be struck by storm surge. A flat plain that seems safe in the dry season can become a sheet of moving water. Before writing, before maps, before formal histories, people learned through the body that home was not always as firm as it felt. A flood could turn familiar paths into channels, storage pits into mud, fire hearths into cold ash, and graves into places no longer reachable. Here, the origin of the human story quietly touches the origin of flood memory. Long before a text was written, human beings were already creatures who survived by remembering landscapes. To remember where water was, where it had been, and where it might return was not just knowledge. It was protection for the next night, the next season, and the next generation. When later cultures wrote about a great flood, they were not writing from nowhere. They were inheriting an old relationship between the human body and unstable ground. The ancient texts may speak in sacred language, with gods, warnings, boats, judgments, and renewals. But beneath those forms lies a plain condition. People lived where water made life possible, and therefore where water could become disaster. This does not mean every flood story points back to one single event. It means that many communities may have carried similar fears because they lived within similar limits. They needed rivers, yet feared them. They needed rain, yet watched the sky with uncertainty. They needed fertile lowlands, yet those lowlands could be the first to vanish. Over time, the shock of such loss could become more than a report. It could become a lesson, a ritual memory, a warning, or a sacred beginning. A story told beside a fire might be repeated until the original bank, village, or storm was no longer clear, while the emotional shape remained. Water came, the old order failed, and life had to begin again. That is why ancient flood traditions deserve a careful ear. Their similarity is not proof of one hidden catastrophe, but it is not meaningless. It points toward a shared human problem at the beginning of settled life, how to live by the element that could erase the places people loved. To understand why flood memory appears in so many places, it helps to begin not with temples or tablets, but with the ordinary geography of survival. Early communities did not choose landscapes because they were beautiful or easy to describe. They settled where food, water, fuel, and movement could be found with some reliability. A river bend could bring fish and fresh water. A lake edge could gather birds, reeds, and animals. A coastal inlet could offer shellfish and roots along the shore. For people whose safety depended on daily contact with the living world, The shape of the land entered the body. Feet learned paths. Hands learned clay, reeds, nets, baskets, and wet soil. Children grew up knowing the smell of mud after rain, the sound of water rising, and the places where adults became quiet because the river was no longer behaving as expected. Long before written history, human beings were already building memory around water because water decided where a group could remain. That is the beginning point behind many later stories, not a single dramatic moment, but the slow fact that human settlement often grew beside the same force that could undo it. A flood in such a place was never only water moving across ground. It could interrupt the stored pattern of life. Food pits could spoil. Animals could scatter. Paths between families could disappear. A shelter that had seemed secure yesterday could become unreachable by morning. The most frightening loss may not have been objects alone, but orientation. When familiar land becomes water, the mind loses the map it trusted. A person can look at the place where a doorway, a field, or a burial ground should be and see only a surface moving under grey light. That experience does not need exaggeration to become powerful. For communities living before modern forecasting, before engineered levees, and before written records were common, the memory of such a change would matter, because forgetting could be dangerous. A child who learned that the low-ground floods at certain times inherited more than a story. The child inherited a rule for survival. Here, the origin of human culture and the origin of flood tradition meet. Stories helped carry practical knowledge, but they also carried the weight of fear, grief, and gratitude after survival. Over generations, a local flood could become larger in the telling, not necessarily because people intended to deceive, but because oral memory often preserves meaning more strongly than measurement. The exact depth of the water, the number of days, or the edge of the flooded land might fade. What remained was the pattern. Warning was needed, safety was fragile, and life after water had to be rebuilt. This is why flood stories could travel so deeply into ritual, law, poetry, and sacred writing. They held a memory useful at the level of the body and meaningful at the level of the community. They told people that the place of origin, the home from which families understood themselves, could be threatened by the same element that made farming, drinking, cooking, and cleansing possible. The repetition of flood themes across cultures becomes less surprising when seen through this slow human condition. People did not need to share one exact disaster to share the experience of vulnerable settlement. River valleys in different regions could rise. Monsoon lands could be overwhelmed. Coasts could be struck by storm and gradual sea change. Low plains could hold water long after rain had stopped. Each environment had its own timing and scale, and each community would explain danger with the language it knew. Some spoke through gods, some through ancestors, some through moral order, and some through renewal after destruction. The surface of the stories may differ, but the human situation beneath them remains close. Bodies dependent on water, homes placed near water, memory shaped by water, and generations trying to teach one another how not to be taken by surprise again. The question becomes sharper. If many old traditions speak of a great flood, what exactly are they remembering? It is tempting to imagine one enormous disaster behind every story, a single ancient event so powerful that echoes of it travelled across languages and centuries. That idea has gravity because humans look for one source behind repeated patterns. When different voices describe water rising, life being reduced, and a world beginning again, the mind wants to draw a line back to one lost moment. Yet careful thinking moves more slowly. Similar stories can grow from a shared event, but they can also grow from similar lives under similar environmental pressure. A farming village beside a river, a fishing community near a coast, and a settlement on a low plain may never know one another. Yet each may learn that water can cross the boundary between safety and danger. Ancient flood tradition may begin not only in one place, but wherever human beings first learned that home depends on ground staying visible. This returns us to the deep beginning of human life. Before sacred texts, people inherited bodies made for memory, movement, hunger, thirst, fear, and attachment. A landscape was not just scenery. It was the pattern that allowed a group to survive. Where to drink, where to sleep, where to cross, where to avoid soft ground, where the river had risen before. These details could decide who endured into another season. When water destroyed a familiar landscape, it also injured the memory system by which a community understood safety. That is why flood stories often carry more weight than ordinary weather. They describe a condition in which the world fails to behave like a world. The floor becomes uncertain, the horizon changes. The places that held the dead, stored food, tools, and children are pulled into the same moving surface. A later text may speak through divine warning or cosmic judgment, but the older human experience beneath it is easier to recognize. People had to explain how life could continue after the place of life was broken. This does not require us to turn myth into literal history, and it does not require us to dismiss myth as empty invention. A careful middle path is more useful. Ancient flood stories may preserve fragments of real environmental memory, reshaped through ritual, belief, and storytelling. Some may reflect local floods in river valleys. Some may carry memories of storms, coastal loss, or long changes in water levels. Some may have borrowed motifs from neighboring cultures, especially where trade, migration, conquest, or writing connected communities. Others may have developed independently because the experience was common enough to produce similar shapes. The similarities matter, but they must be handled gently. A boat, a warning, surviving animals, a chosen family, or the return of dry land can feel like evidence of one origin. Yet these images also answer basic problems. How do living beings survive when the ground is gone? How does a community preserve life when food, shelter, and kinship are threatened? How does memory turn disaster into instruction for those not yet born? At the beginning of settled human life, these questions were not distant philosophy. They belonged to mud under the feet, river marks on trees, stories told to children, and silence after loss. So the answer cannot be a simple yes or no. The ancient texts that describe similar floods may not all point to one disaster remembered by everyone. They may point to something equally important, a repeated human encounter with water as both origin and erasure. The first communities needed water to become stable, and because they needed it, they lived close enough to fear it. Out of that closeness came stories that travelled farther than the flood itself. They carried warning, grief, and comfort. Even when the old ground vanished, memory could give survivors a way to begin again. Before a flood becomes a story, it is first a physical event felt by the body. The feet notice it before the mind gives it meaning. Ground that was firm yesterday softens under weight. Cold water reaches the ankles, then the knees, and the body begins to understand that the familiar world is changing faster than memory can organize it. A person does not need a written calendar to feel danger when stored food is wet, when a fire cannot be kept alive, when children must be lifted, when animals cry or scatter, when darkness comes, and the sound of water still continues. Ancient texts often turn floods into events of divine decision or cosmic renewal, but underneath those forms is a simpler human fact. Water threatens the body by taking away the ordinary conditions that allow life to continue. Warmth, shelter, dry ground, food, sleep, and orientation all depend on a stable place. When that place is covered, survival becomes immediate. The human mind may later remember the event through sacred language, but the first memory is likely closer to breath, cold, hunger, and the effort to keep the living together. This matters because the oldest roots of flood tradition do not begin only in belief. They begin in the nervous system of a creature that evolved to read danger in the landscape. Human beings are not strong compared with floodwater. We cannot push back a river with our hands. We cannot breathe under rising water. We cannot protect infants, elders, tools, animals and food all at once when the ground itself stops helping us. What the body can do is notice, fear, remember, and teach. A mark on a tree, a story about a low place, a warning about the season when the river grows restless. These are ways a vulnerable body turns danger into shared knowledge. In this sense, flood memory may be one of the oldest kinds of environmental memory because it links the body to place with unusual force. It says, here is where life was possible, and here is how life nearly ended. When later communities repeated stories of a great flood, they were not simply describing water as an object. They were describing the collapse of ordinary trust. A person trusts that the floor will hold. A family trusts that a home will remain where it was built. A village trusts paths, storage places, burial places, fields, and meeting grounds. Floodwater breaks those quiet agreements. It moves through the spaces where human order had been placed. It enters the house, covers the path, changes the smell of the air, and makes the known landscape unreadable. That kind of experience leaves a different mark from an ordinary storm. It is not only fear of dying, it is the fear that the world has lost its shape. Here again, the story returns to the beginning of human life as a remembering species. Our ancestors survived not by force alone, but by carrying useful patterns across generations. They learned where animals moved, where plants returned, where stone could be found, where water could be trusted, and where water should be feared. A flood damaged more than objects because it damaged the pattern itself. Afterward, people had to rebuild shelter, but also rebuild confidence in the place. They had to decide whether to remain, move, change habits, or tell the young what had happened so the same surprise would not fall on them unprepared. This may help explain why flood stories often feel larger than local geography. The body experiences flood as total because, inside the small circle of a life, it can be total. A valley may flood, not the world, yet for the people living there, the whole known world may seem to have gone under. A village may be destroyed, not humanity, yet for the families who lose their ground, tools, animals, and dead, the break can feel like the ending of an age. Ancient writing can turn that feeling into a vast image, everything covered, everything reduced, everything waiting for dry land again. Read carefully. Such images do not have to be treated as false records or exact reports. They can be understood as human memory shaped by the body's encounter with helplessness and by the long need to make danger speak to those who were not there. A community does not remember a flood the way a measuring instrument records height and time. It remembers through bodies, losses, repairs, and repeated telling. One person may remember the sound of water at night. Another may remember where stored grain was ruined. Another may remember carrying a child or finding that a path to relatives had vanished. When these memories are gathered into a shared story, they do not remain separate pieces. They become a common shape, something the group can hold together after the mud dries. This is one reason ancient flood traditions can feel both historical and symbolic. They may contain traces of real danger, but they are also shaped by what a community needed the memory to do. A flood remembered only as a date would fade from ordinary life. A flood remembered as a warning, a moral boundary, or a beginning after ruin could remain alive for generations. Human memory has always worked within social life. From the beginning, people survived by sharing what one body alone could not safely learn again and again. Where the water rises, which bank collapses, which season brings danger, which ground stays higher, these details matter because they turn experience into protection. Yet memory changes when it is passed from elder to child, from family to family, from spoken story into ritual or written form. The change does not automatically make the memory false. It means the memory has entered culture. It begins to carry grief, fear, identity, and instruction at the same time. A group may no longer preserve the exact depth of the flood, but it may preserve the sense that the ordinary world can fail and that survival depends on listening before the water arrives. This helps explain why similar flood stories can travel through time without remaining exact reports. Collective memory tends to protect meaning more strongly than measurement. A story may grow wider because the emotional world of the survivors felt wide. A local valley may become the whole earth in language because no other world was visible when water covered every known landmark. A few days of danger may become a sacred interval because ordinary time had been broken. The path of the water and the first cause may become unclear, while the lesson remains steady. Life is fragile when the place that holds it changes. At the origin of human storytelling, this was not a weakness. It was a survival tool. A story that could be remembered was more useful than a record no one could carry. The same process appears when ancient texts give flood memory a larger order. They often place the event within relationships between humans, the divine, animals, land, and renewal. That does not mean every detail should be read as a direct map of an ancient disaster. It means the writers and transmitters were trying to place overwhelming loss inside a pattern that could be understood. A flood without meaning is only terror, A flood made into memory becomes something a community can return to without being destroyed by it again. The story can say, danger came, the world changed, some life continued, and the next generation must not forget. In that form, the flood becomes more than water. It becomes a vessel for teaching how humans live with forces larger than themselves. The careful listener should therefore hear ancient flood traditions in two ways at once. They may point toward real experiences of inundation, ruined food, broken settlements, and uncertainty. They also reveal how human groups turned such experiences into shared memory, not to preserve every physical detail, but to protect a deeper truth about dependence and loss. From the earliest communities near rivers and coasts to later cultures that wrote sacred accounts, the same need remained: to remember the moment when water crossed the line between life-giver and destroyer, and to carry that memory forward before another generation stood on vulnerable ground. Oral memory is never motionless. When a flood is first survived, it may begin as a set of plain facts. The water came in the night, the lower houses were lost, the animals had to be moved, the old path could not be crossed, the stored food was spoiled, and the dead could not be visited for a time. But as years pass, the facts are carried by voices, not by instruments. A grandmother tells what her mother heard. A father points toward a low field and says the water once reached farther than anyone expected. Children hear the story before they understand the full weight of it. Later, they tell it with the details that stayed in them most strongly. In this way, a real event can change shape without becoming meaningless. The location may blur, the season may become symbolic, the number of days may become less certain. The people in the story may become figures of warning, obedience, pride, fear, or survival. Yet the emotional center can remain steady. Water came, safety failed, and life had to be gathered again from what remained. This is one of the most important ways to think about ancient flood traditions. A story can be altered by time and still carry an old human experience. It does not have to be treated as either perfect history or pure invention. Human communities, especially before widespread writing, protected memory through repetition, rhythm, image, and meaning. A story that was too plain might be forgotten. A story that gave disaster a shape could be remembered. The boat, the high ground, the warning, the chosen survivor, the animals, the return of land. These images may grow because they help the mind hold terror without losing order. They answer questions that matter to vulnerable people. What should be saved first? Who listens when danger is still invisible? How does a family remain a family when the old place is gone? How does a community speak about the dead without letting grief become silence? These questions reach back toward the beginning of human culture, when survival depended not only on tools and fire, but on passing remembered danger across generations. The first people did not survive by strength alone. They survived because one life could teach another life what it had learned from hunger, cold, animals, storms, water, and loss. Over time, spoken flood memory could also become moral memory. A dangerous event might be retold as a warning about arrogance, neglect, violence, impurity, or failure to listen. That does not prove the original event happened exactly as the later text describes it. It shows how communities often make disaster speak in the language of values. When people suffer something too large to easily explain, they may ask not only what happened, but what kind of world allows it to happen. Ancient flood stories often stand at that point where environment, fear, and meaning meet. They preserve the practical memory of unstable water, while also asking whether human life has an order that can survive destruction. This layered process helps explain why the same kind of story can appear in more than one place. Some traditions may have influenced one another through contact, migration, trade, conquest, or shared writing cultures. Others may have grown separately from similar experiences in flood-prone landscapes. In both cases, oral memory can stretch an event beyond its first boundaries. The flood becomes not just the flood of one river or one coast, but the image of a world reduced to water. For the people who inherited the tale, that image may have felt true even if the physical event was local, because the known world of the survivors had truly been broken. What remained was not a measurement. It was a human pattern. loss, warning, survival, and beginning again. That pattern is why ancient texts about floods still feel close to the origin of human memory itself. When the flood enters written tradition, it no longer belongs only to one riverbank or one frightened household. It becomes language that can outlive the people who first spoke it. The old texts do not all say the same thing, and they should not be forced into one simple pattern. They come from different regions, different religions, different periods, and different ways of imagining the world. Yet it is still striking that water appears again and again as the force that interrupts human order. In Mesopotamian traditions, stories connected with Atrahasis and Gilgamesh speak of a great flood, a warned survivor, a vessel, and life preserved through catastrophe. In the Hebrew Bible, the account of Noah gives the flood a powerful moral and covenantal meaning, turning water into both judgment and renewal. In Greek tradition, the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha tells of survival after a destructive flood and the reappearance of human life. In ancient Indian tradition, the story of Manu includes a warning, a great fish, rising waters, and the preservation of life through guidance. These stories are not identical records. They are not proof, by themselves, that every culture remembered one exact disaster, but they show that many societies use the image of overwhelming water to speak about ending, survival, and the fragile beginning of a renewed human world. To listen carefully, it is important to respect each tradition in its own setting. Mesopotamian flood stories emerged from a region where great rivers shaped agriculture, cities, trade, and political power. Their world was not an empty stage for myth. It was a landscape where water could be controlled only imperfectly, where irrigation brought abundance, and where flooding could threaten settlements built from mudbrick and human labor. The Hebrew account grew within a different religious and literary tradition, and its meaning cannot be reduced to geography alone. It speaks about human conduct, divine response, preservation, and promise. Greek and Indian stories have their own symbolic worlds, with their own ideas about time, gods, ancestry, and renewal. Other cultures also preserved flood traditions in oral or written form, but the evidence is uneven, and the details must be handled with care. A calm reading does not flatten them into one story. It notices both resemblance and difference. The resemblance asks why water became such a strong image for human loss. The difference reminds us that each community reshaped danger according to its own memory, values, and place in history. This brings the question back to the deep beginning of human life. Long before writing fixed words on clay, papyrus, parchment, palm leaf, or manuscript, people carried memory through voice. They carried it because the body needed guidance in a world where rivers shifted, storms came, coasts changed, and low ground could become unsafe. When these memories eventually entered text, they did not arrive as raw notes from an eyewitness. They arrived already shaped by generations of telling. A text may preserve an old fear, but it also preserves the culture that gave that fear meaning. That is why ancient flood accounts must be read slowly. If we treat them as exact scientific reports, we ask them to do something they were not designed to do. If we dismiss them as empty imagination, we lose the human experience they may carry. Between those extremes is a quieter possibility. These texts may hold traces of real encounters with destructive water, transformed into sacred, moral, or ancestral memory. Their shared pattern may reflect contact between cultures in some cases, and independent experience in others. The oldest question is therefore not only whether one flood stood behind them all, it is why early human communities, separated by place and language, so often found in water the image of a world ending and beginning again. Across the old flood traditions, the details shift, but several shapes return with quiet persistence. There is often a warning before the water arrives. Someone hears, dreams, receives instruction, reads danger in signs, or is told to prepare while the rest of the world continues as if the ground will always remain itself. There is often a survivor, not always heroic in the modern sense, but set apart by listening, building, waiting, or being guided. There is often a vessel, a chest, an ark, a boat, or some protected space where life can be carried while the land is hidden. There are sometimes animals, seeds, family lines, or sacred things preserved so that the world after the flood will not be empty. Then, after the water, there is usually a return of order. dry ground, an offering, a covenant, a new beginning, or a changed relationship between people and the powers they believe govern the world. These shared images matter, but they should be handled without rushing. A warning does not prove that all stories came from one warning. A boat does not prove that all peoples remembered the same boat. Similar images can arise because similar dangers ask similar questions. If water covers the ground, what can be saved? If the old settlement fails, where can life be held? If a community survives, how does it explain why survival was possible when so much else was lost? The answer often takes the form of a protected remnant. That remnant may be a family, a pair, a group of animals, a seed of future life, or simply memory itself. Here, the ancient texts are close to the beginning of human experience. Human beings became human not only by making tools, but by keeping fragile things alive across breaks in time: children, fire, stored food, roots, names, and teachings. A flood story gives that older task a dramatic shape. The world is reduced, and something small must carry life through it. This may be why animals appear in some accounts. In many ancient societies, animals meant food, labour, companionship, sacrifice, wealth, and the ordinary rhythm of life. To preserve animals is to imagine that the future needs more than human breath. It needs the living network around people to continue. The same is true of seeds, tools, or sacred objects where they appear. A community after disaster cannot begin again from nothing. It needs continuity. It needs some thread tied to the time before the water. The repeated image of dry land returning is just as meaningful. Dry ground is not merely scenery after the flood. It is the restoration of the human world. Feet can stand, fire can burn, bodies can sleep without drifting, food can be planted, the dead can be remembered in place. Children can learn paths again. In the deep history of people living near rivers, lakes, marshes, and coasts, dry ground was the quiet partner of water. Water gave life, but ground allowed life to gather into homes, fields, graves, and stories. When ancient texts describe water withdrawing, they are also describing the return of orientation. The world becomes readable again. Yet the world after the flood is rarely exactly the old world. Something has changed. A promise may be made. A rule may be given. A new ancestor may stand at the beginning of later generations. These motifs turn disaster into a memory of order restored, but not innocence restored. The survivors carry a reminder that the human place in the world is conditional. This is why the similarities between flood traditions feel deep, even when the historical pathways remain uncertain. They gather around basic human needs: warning before danger, shelter during danger, continuity after danger, and meaning after loss. Those needs belong to the long origin of human communities, when survival depended on remembering what the landscape could do and teaching that memory before the next generation had to learn it alone. The ancient texts that describe great floods may differ in language, belief, and setting, but many of them return to the same human image: life held in a small space while the larger world becomes water. Similarity can be persuasive because the mind wants patterns to become answers. When several ancient traditions speak of a great flood, a warned survivor, preserved life, and land returning after water, it is easy to feel that one hidden event must stand behind them all. That feeling is understandable, but it is not the same as proof. Human history is full of repeated forms that arise from repeated conditions. Many peoples built shelters, buried the dead, marked seasons, watched stars, honored ancestors, and feared famine without needing one single origin for every custom. Flood stories may work in a similar way. Their shared shapes may come from contact between cultures in some places, from inherited literary influence in others, and from independent experience where landscapes placed people near dangerous water. A careful reading lets these possibilities remain open without forcing the evidence to say more than it can safely say. The ancient texts are valuable, but they are not maps drawn by modern surveyors. They are memories shaped by language, belief, and the needs of communities trying to understand loss. This is especially important when thinking about the deep beginning of human settlement. People did not become dependent on rivers and coasts because they were careless. They did so because water made life possible. It offered fish, plants, drinking water, fertile soil, transport, and gathering places for animals. The same environments that help people remain in one place also exposed them to sudden change. A flood in one river valley could produce a story of warning and survival. A storm along another coast could produce a story of water crossing the edge of the known world. A slow loss of lowland might be remembered as the disappearance of ancestral ground. These events do not have to be identical to create similar memory. They only have to touch the same human vulnerability, the loss of stable ground beneath a life built around water. Some resemblances among flood traditions may indeed reflect historical contact. Stories travel with traders, migrants, scribes, captives, priests, and families. In regions where cultures shared languages, borders, and writing systems, motifs could move and be reshaped. Mesopotamian flood traditions and later Near Eastern accounts, for example, are often discussed together because they belong to overlapping historical worlds where texts and ideas could influence one another. That is a reasonable field of comparison, but extending that comparison to every flood story everywhere requires more caution. A motif found in two distant places is not automatically evidence of one source. It may show shared inheritance, borrowing, coincidence, or the simple fact that human beings face similar problems when water destroys home. The difference between these explanations matters because the central question is not only dramatic, it is historical. What can be responsibly said and what must remain uncertain? The more honest answer is slower, but stronger. Similar motifs show that flood memory carried deep meaning across human cultures. They do not, by themselves, prove that everyone remembered one disaster. The boat, the survivor, the animals, the mountain, the receding water, and the renewed world are powerful because they solve narrative problems that real floods create. They give shape to survival when measurement is gone. They protect the idea that life can continue after the familiar landscape has failed. In that sense, the ancient texts may preserve not a single worldwide memory, but a family of human responses to one of the oldest environmental fears. They remind us that early communities lived close to the edge between gift and danger. Water fed the field and could cover it. Water joined settlements and could separate them. Water marked origin and could become erasure. The shared flood stories do not close the mystery. They make it more human, because they show that many peoples, in many places, looked at rising water and found the same difficult thought. A world can end locally and still be remembered as everything. To understand why Mesopotamia became so important to flood memory, it is useful to imagine a flat land held between two powerful rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates did not simply pass through the region as scenery. They shaped the soil, the fields, the routes of movement, and the daily imagination of people who lived there. In southern Mesopotamia especially, communities depended on water management for crops, canals, animals, and city life. The land could be generous when water was guided well, leaving fertile possibilities in a dry environment. But generosity and danger were never fully separate. A river that carried life could also break banks, shift channels, drown fields, damage mud brick walls, and turn planned labor into confusion. In a world without modern forecasting, the difference between useful water and destructive water could be frighteningly thin. This setting does not prove any single flood story as literal record. It explains why water could become one of the strongest images through which people in this region thought about order, disorder, survival, and the beginning again of human life. Mesopotamian cities were achievements of coordination. People dug canals, stored grain, organized labor, traded goods, built temples, and gave shape to political power. Yet all of that rested on materials that remained close to the earth: clay, reeds, mud brick, fields, animals, and human bodies working in heat and seasonal uncertainty. The same wet clay that could be shaped into tablets for writing could also remind people that the land itself was never completely fixed. Houses and walls made from sun-dried brick could erode when water entered them. Fields could be enriched by controlled irrigation, but also ruined by too much water or by salt building in the soil over time. The early human story here is not a story of people conquering nature once and for all. It is a story of people learning to live through constant negotiation with water. That is why the flood in Mesopotamian imagination can feel so large. It threatens not only individual lives, but the entire arrangement by which a settled world holds together. When ancient Mesopotamian texts speak of overwhelming water, they come from a landscape where the border between civilization and vulnerability was visible. The city may appear solid, but it is still made of earth. The canal may appear controlled, but it still depends on flow. The harvest may appear promised, but it still waits on water behaving within limits. This kind of environment could make flood memory practical before it became poetic. People needed to remember where water had risen, which lands were safer, how canals behaved, and what signs might mean danger. Over generations, practical memory could grow into larger stories about divine decision, human noise, kingship, obedience, survival, and restoration. Such stories were not merely invented from nothing. They were shaped within a region where people knew that water management was the condition of life, and that failed water management, or water beyond management, could expose the smallness of human planning. The beginning of human civilization in Mesopotamia, therefore, carries a quiet contradiction. Stability was built beside instability. Cities rose because water could be drawn into fields, yet those same waters remained capable of undoing fields and cities. Writing helped preserve memory, law, trade, and myth, but the oldest pressure underneath was still physical: how to keep people alive in a place where dry land, wet soil, and moving rivers formed one fragile system. This is why Mesopotamia matters so much in the wider question of ancient flood texts. It gives us a real environment where flood stories could make deep sense without needing to become simple proof of a worldwide event. In the land between the rivers, water was not only a symbol, it was the daily partner of survival, and sometimes the force that reminded human beings that every built world begins on ground that can change. The Mesopotamian flood traditions are among the most discussed, because they place overwhelming water inside one of the world's earliest urban worlds. In the story, often called Atrahasis, the flood is not merely a storm. It belongs to a wider reflection on people, labour, divine authority, noise, limits, and survival. In the flood account found within the Epic of Gilgamesh, a survivor tells how warning came before destruction, how a great vessel was prepared, how living beings were preserved, and how the return of land was tested after the waters. These stories should be approached with patience. They are not modern eyewitness reports, and they are not simple newspaper accounts of one measured event. They are literary and religious works shaped by scribes, memory, and the worldview of ancient Mesopotamia. Yet they also do not float above real life. They come from a river landscape where water was the difference between food and hunger, order and collapse, settlement and abandonment. What makes these Mesopotamian stories so powerful is the way they connect natural danger with social order. A flood does not only destroy houses, it interrupts the whole arrangement of life that people had made together. Canals, fields, storehouses, animals, temples, families, and labour systems all depend on the land remaining usable. When water crosses its limits, the human world loses its structure. The story of a warned survivor, therefore, is not only about one person escaping. It is about the preservation of a small seed of order when the wider order is gone. In that sense, the vessel in the tale becomes more than a practical object. It becomes a temporary world. Inside it, life is gathered while the outside world is unreadable. This image reaches back toward the beginning of settled human life. Early communities learned that survival required more than individual strength. It required stored food, shared labour, memory of seasons, care for animals, and trust in places that could be returned to. A flood threatened all of those at once, so a story about surviving water naturally became a story about what must be carried forward. The Mesopotamian accounts also remind us that ancient people often understood disaster through relationships between humans and powers larger than humans. The language of gods, decisions, warnings, and offerings belongs to that cultural world. A careful listener does not need to remove those elements in order to find historical value, and does not need to treat every image as literal geography. The important thing is to notice how the texts place flood within a moral and cosmic frame. Water is not only a physical force, it becomes a sign that human life has limits. Cities may grow, kings may rule, canals may be cut, tablets may be written, but the world remains dependent on forces that no ruler fully controls. That thought would have been deeply understandable in a place where water could be guided, but never completely mastered. The flood survivor in Mesopotamian tradition carries memory across rupture. He stands at the thin line between the drowned world and the renewed one, holding the knowledge that life continued not because humans were invincible, but because something fragile was preserved. This is why such stories could endure in written form. They spoke to the central anxiety of early civilization, the fear that the very systems that make life stable can be overwhelmed. The river feeds the field feeds the city produces writing, and writing preserves the story of the river becoming too much. Seen this way, Atrahasis and Gilgamesh are not useful because they prove a global flood. They are useful because they show how one ancient river civilization turned the danger of water into a meditation on order, memory, and the narrow passage by which human life survives disaster. Archaeology gives the flood question a different kind of silence. Texts speak in voices, images, warnings, and sacred meanings, but the ground speaks through layers. A settlement floor, a deposit of silt, a broken wall, a change in pottery, a pause in occupation, or a rebuilt house can suggest that water once interrupted ordinary life. In Mesopotamia, archaeologists have found evidence for flooding at some ancient sites, and this matters because it shows that destructive floods were not only imagined, rivers did rise. Settlements could be damaged, mud could cover the traces of human activity, people could rebuild over the same place, leaving the earth itself with a memory of interruption. Yet this evidence must be held carefully. A flood layer at one site is not automatically a flood layer everywhere. A deposit of water-laid sediment does not, by itself, become proof of a world-covering disaster. It must be studied in relation to local geography, the depth of the layer, the materials above and below it, and the wider pattern of settlement in the region. The ground can confirm that floods happened, but it does not always tell the same story that later texts tell. This is where honesty becomes more valuable than drama. Some Mesopotamian sites have shown signs of major local flooding, and scholars have long discussed whether such events may have influenced later flood traditions. That is a reasonable possibility. A severe flood in a river plain could have felt enormous to those who lived through it. If water covered the known fields, damaged houses, separated families, and forced rebuilding, survivors would not need to see the whole planet underwater for the experience to feel like the end of the world. Their world was the land they knew, the paths they walked, the temples or houses they trusted, the graves and fields that held their memory. When that world was covered, the emotional truth could become vast, even if the physical event was regional. This returns us again to the beginning of settled human life. Human beings did not experience disaster from a distance. They experienced it through the collapse of practical order: where to sleep, where to cook, where to keep animals, where to find dry fuel, where to bury the dead, where to plant again. A layer of mud in the ground may look quiet now, but for the people who left it behind, it may have meant hunger, displacement, grief, and the need to begin again. Still, archaeology also places limits around the story. The known flood deposits in Mesopotamia do not all belong to one single moment, and they do not form a clean, universal pattern across the whole region. Some places show evidence of flooding, others do not show the same kind of interruption. The rivers themselves changed over time, and each city or settlement stood in its own relationship to channels, low ground, levees, and fields. This unevenness is not a weakness of science. It is the reason careful interpretation is possible. It prevents us from taking a powerful text and forcing every piece of earth to fit it. The evidence points toward real floods in a flood-prone landscape, but it does not require the conclusion that one event drowned all human life. In fact, the more grounded view may be more meaningful. Mesopotamian flood stories could have grown from a world where many memories of water, loss, and rebuilding were possible. One event may have mattered deeply. Several events may have blended in cultural memory. Older oral traditions may have carried the fear before scribes shaped it into literature. Later writers may have turned environmental danger into a reflection on divine order, kingship, survival, and human limits. Archaeology cannot recover every voice that told the story before it was written, but it can remind us that the setting was real. People built cities from earth in a land of rivers. They depended on water, struggled to direct it, and sometimes watched it exceed the boundaries that made life stable. The ancient flood texts should therefore be read neither as simple fantasy nor as finished scientific evidence. They stand between ground and memory, The mud beneath old settlements says that water truly came. The texts say that people needed to remember what water meant. Between those two forms of evidence, a calmer answer begins to appear. The flood tradition may not preserve one universal disaster, but it does preserve the lived knowledge that civilization began on vulnerable ground. The story of Noah is one of the most widely known flood accounts in the world, but it should be approached with care. For many people, it belongs to sacred tradition, faith, worship, and moral reflection. For historians, literary scholars, and careful listeners, it also belongs to a long family of ancient flood narratives that speak about water, judgment, preservation, and renewed life. These ways of reading do not have to be forced into conflict inside a sleep audio about human memory. The important thing is not to reduce the story to a modern weather report, and not to use it as simple proof of a single global disaster. It is a religious text with deep cultural power. It speaks in the language of divine decision, human conduct, obedience, destruction, mercy, and promise. When the waters rise in the story, they do more than cover land. They place the whole human condition under question. What happens when life becomes violent, fragile, and unable to trust its own order? In that sense, the flood becomes a moral image as much as an environmental one. It is not only about rain or rivers, it is about a world that has gone wrong, and about the preservation of life through a narrow passage. The figure of Noah stands at that passage, not simply as a survivor of water, but as a bearer of continuity. Family, animals, memory, and the possibility of future generations are gathered into a protected space while the old world disappears from view. This image reaches far back into the human beginning. Long before formal scripture, people had already learned that survival often depended on carrying the small things forward: children, food, fire, animals, tools, names, and warnings. A flood story gives that ancient task a sacred shape. It asks what must be saved when almost everything else is lost. It also asks whether survival is only physical, or whether it must include a new relationship with the world after danger has passed. In the account of Noah, water is followed by promise. Dry ground returns, but the return is not presented as a simple reset. The world after the flood carries memory. It has been marked by loss, and that loss becomes part of how the future is understood. This is one reason the story has remained so powerful. It does not speak only to people who have seen a flood. It speaks to anyone who knows that human order can fail, that safety can be interrupted, and that a life rebuilt after loss is not the same as a life untouched by it. Still, a careful script must keep its boundaries clear. The Noah account should not be treated as direct scientific evidence for a planet-wide flood in the modern geological sense. Ancient religious writing works through meaning, structure, symbol, memory, and belief. It can preserve ancient fears about water without functioning like a laboratory record. At the same time, it should not be dismissed as empty invention. It belongs to a world where floods were real, rivers mattered, and human communities understood that water could both bless and destroy. Its closeness to other Near Eastern flood traditions suggests a shared cultural world in which stories, motifs, and questions could move, be reshaped, and receive new meaning. The value of the Noah story, for the question of ancient texts and remembered disaster, lies in that layered position. It stands between environment and ethics, between physical danger and moral interpretation, between the memory of human vulnerability and the hope that life can continue. It reminds us that when ancient people told of a flood, they were often asking something larger than where the water came from. They were asking how a broken world could become livable again. In the Noah account, water is frightening because it does not only kill, it removes the visible shape of the world. Fields, paths, houses, boundaries, and familiar distances are all placed beneath one surface. The story turns floodwater into an image of erasure, as if the ordinary marks by which humans recognize home have been wiped away. This is why the water feels different from a simple storm. A storm passes over the world and leaves the world still readable. A flood, in this kind of ancient imagination, makes the world unreadable. There is no road to follow, no field edge to trust, no doorway that clearly separates inside from outside. The human place becomes uncertain, and the mind is forced to ask whether life can continue when the land that held it is gone. That question gives the story much of its depth. The flood is not only a disaster in nature, it is a crisis of order. The old arrangement of life fails, and everything that survives must pass through a narrow space before a new arrangement can begin. The ark, therefore, is not only a boat, it is a small world inside the loss of the larger one. It gathers human life, animal life, and the possibility of future life into a protected boundary. In a calm reading, this image is powerful because it reflects an old human concern. From the earliest communities, people survived by preserving continuity through danger. A group had to keep children alive, protect tools, carry food, remember roots, care for animals, and hold stories long enough for the next generation to inherit them. The Noah story gives that ancient survival task a sacred form. It asks what kind of life deserves to be carried forward, and what kind of world might appear after ruin. When the waters withdraw, the return of dry ground is not simply a return to comfort. It is the return of orientation. Feet can stand again, fire can be made again, animals can move across land again, a family can step out into space that can be measured, crossed, worked and remembered. Yet the story does not treat this as if nothing happened. The world after the flood is marked by promise, obligation, and memory. That matters. Ancient flood stories often place renewal after destruction, but renewal is rarely innocent. It carries the knowledge that stability can fail. In the Noah account, water becomes a boundary between two moral conditions, the world before the flood and the world after it. The old world is not simply wet. It is judged, ended, and remembered as something that could not continue unchanged. The new world is not guaranteed by human strength alone. It begins under the sign of preservation and restraint. This is why the flood can be read as a symbol of both loss and beginning. It removes, but it also reveals what must be kept. It silences the old ground, but it makes the first steps onto new ground feel meaningful. The story's emotional power may come from this balance. Human beings know, through the long history of living near water, that survival after disaster is not just staying alive. It is learning how to live afterward without forgetting what was nearly lost. At the origin of human communities, this lesson would have been practical before it became theological or literary. People who returned after a flood had to rebuild storage, shelter, paths, trust, and memory. They had to decide where to settle, what to teach, and how to explain the break between before and after. The Noah account gives that break a moral structure. It does not need to be handled as a geological report to remain important. It shows how an ancient culture used water to think about cleansing, judgment, preservation, and the fragile hope that life can begin again without pretending the loss never happened. The Noah account becomes even more interesting when placed beside older and neighbouring flood traditions, especially those from Mesopotamia. The comparison should be made gently. It is not necessary to say that one story is simply copied from another, and it is not responsible to claim that all of them prove one universal event. What can be said more safely is that the ancient Near East was a connected world. People moved, goods moved, conquests changed borders. Scribes learned, adapted, preserved, and reworked inherited materials. Stories did not remain sealed inside one city or one language. They could travel through trade, exile, translation, schooling, ritual, and memory. In that kind of world, a powerful flood narrative could pass from one setting into another and receive a new meaning. Mesopotamian traditions such as Atrahasis and the flood account within Gilgamesh speak of warning, a chosen survivor, a large vessel, preserved life, and the return of dry land. The Noah account contains several familiar shapes, yet it gives them a distinctive religious and moral form. The flood becomes part of a relationship between human behavior, divine judgment, mercy, promise, and the future of creation. This is how texts change when they move. A motif may remain recognizable, while its purpose becomes different. A boat may still preserve life, but the meaning of preservation may shift. A survivor may still cross the waters, but the reason for survival may be explained through a different understanding of God, humanity, and the world. This process is not strange. It is one of the ordinary ways human culture works. From the deep beginning of our species people carried useful and meaningful stories across distance. A tale told in one valley could be remembered in another. A warning shaped by one river could be understood beside another river because the body already knew what rising water meant. Human beings did not need identical landscapes to recognize the fear of losing ground, food, kin, animals, and orientation. That shared bodily knowledge made flood stories easy to receive and reshape. When writing became part of culture, it gave these stories a more durable form, but it did not freeze them forever. Later communities could take an older pattern and place it inside their own view of time, law, worship, ancestry, and responsibility. This is why the relationship between Noah and Mesopotamian flood traditions matters so much for the Laportian. It shows one possible path by which flood memory can become shared without requiring every culture to have witnessed the same disaster. Shared literature, regional contact, and inherited motifs may explain some similarities. Local experiences of dangerous water may explain others. Both processes can exist at the same time. A flood story may carry echoes of real floods, the influence of older texts, and the moral imagination of a later community. None of these layers cancels the others. They simply remind us that ancient memory is not a single straight line. It is more like sediment, with older fears, newer meanings, and cultural contact resting together. For a truthful reading, the most important move is restraint. The Noah account should not be pulled away from its religious setting and treated only as borrowed mythology. It should also not be isolated from the broader world in which similar flood stories were known. Its power lies partly in the way it receives an ancient human theme and gives it a particular shape. The world can be judged, life can be preserved, and the future can begin under memory rather than forgetfulness. In that sense, the story belongs both to a specific tradition and to the wider human attempt to speak about disaster. The ancient texts that describe floods may not all remember one event, but they do show how a memory of water could travel, change language, gather meaning, and still keep its central image. Life held carefully while the old ground disappears. After the last ice age, the world did not change in a single night. The great sheets of ice withdrew slowly, and the water locked inside them returned to oceans, rivers, lakes, and low places across the earth. To a modern listener, this may sound like a quiet geological process, too slow to become memory. But for human communities living near coasts, estuaries, marshes, and river mouths, slow change could still become personal when it reached the ground where people had walked, hunted, gathered shellfish, buried the dead, or returned season after season. Sea level rise was not one simple flood rushing over all lands at once. It was a long transformation of shorelines, with some periods and places changing more noticeably than others. Beaches moved, river mouths shifted, wetlands expanded or disappeared. Low plains that had once been open ground could become tidal flats, then shallow water, then sea. The map of home changed while generations were still learning where their ancestors had lived. This matters because many flood traditions speak as if water once crossed a boundary it should not have crossed. Post-Ice Age sea rise offers one real background for that kind of memory, without turning every story into proof of one global disaster. It reminds us that the human world has never been fixed. At the beginning of settled and semi-settled life, people did not live on a stable stage. They lived on a changing planet, and many of the best places for food were also places most exposed to water. Coasts offered shellfish, fish, birds, plants, salt marshes, movement by boat, and meeting points between land and sea. River mouths offered fresh water, animals, fertile sediment, and roots inland. These environments could support human life with unusual richness, especially for groups that knew the seasons and returned to reliable places. Yet they were also the kinds of places most likely to change when seas rose and rivers adjusted. A camp close to a lagoon might be safe for one generation and threatened in another. A low passage once crossed on foot might become a channel. A place of gathering might slowly fall beyond daily reach. Human memory does not need a sudden wall of water for loss to become meaningful. Sometimes the quieter pain is watching a familiar edge move until the old ground can no longer be used. In that sense, the end of the Ice Age may have created many local endings. Not one neat catastrophe, but a series of losses scattered through different regions and different lifetimes. Some would have been too gradual to become a dramatic tale. Others may have been sharpened by storms, tides, river floods, or sudden coastal changes, turning a long process into a remembered event. A community might not speak of climate or sea level in modern terms. It might speak of the sea taking land, of ancestors who lived where water now lies, of a warning ignored, of a boat, of a mountain, of a remnant that survived. These forms are not scientific measurements, but they can carry a human truth. People remembered that water had changed the boundary of the world. The connection to ancient flood texts should remain careful. There is no need to claim that every written flood story comes from post-Ice Age sea rise. Texts are shaped by religion, literature, local rivers, cultural contact, and moral imagination. But sea rise after the Ice Age gives the larger human background a real depth. It shows that rising water was not only a mythic idea, it was part of the environment in which human memory developed. The first long histories of people were lived beside shores that moved, rivers that changed, and lowlands that could be lost. If later cultures imagined a time when water covered the old world, they may have been drawing from many sources at once: local floods, inherited stories, sacred teaching, and perhaps very old memories of land that slowly became sea. Imagine a shoreline not as a line on a map, but as a living edge that people knew through footsteps. At low tide, there might be shellfish, wet sand, reeds, driftwood, and channels shallow enough to cross. Farther inland, there might be fresh water, higher ground, camps, paths, and places where families returned because the land had fed them before. Now imagine that edge changing slowly, not always in a single terrifying moment, but season after season, lifetime after lifetime. The place where grandparents gathered food becomes harder to reach. The old path becomes muddy more often. A storm pushes water farther inland than memory expects. A channel widens. A camp near the shore becomes unsafe, then distant, then unreachable. To a geologist, this may be coastal change. To a community, it can become the loss of an ancestral world. This is why drowned lowlands matter for ancient flood memory. Much of early human life was drawn toward edges where land and water met, because those edges were rich. They offered food from two worlds at once: fish, shellfish, birds, reeds, plants, animals coming to drink, and routes for movement. Human origins are tied not only to caves or open plains, but also to practical landscapes where the body learned hunger, return, shelter, and danger. A shore could be a pantry, a road, a boundary, and a memory at the same time. When that shore moved, the change touched every part of life. It did not only remove land, it disturbed knowledge. People had to relearn where to walk, where to fish, where fresh water could be found, where children could safely sleep, and where the dead could still be honoured. That kind of change can enter story because it changes the relationship between people and place. A flood is often imagined as sudden, but rising seas and shifting coasts could produce layered memories. One generation might remember a storm that took the lower shelters. Another might remember that the old gathering ground had become marsh. Another might hear that beyond the present water there had once been dry land. Over time, these memories could compress. A slow process might be told as a taking. A series of storms might become one great crossing of water. A long shoreline retreat might become the story of a world before the sea. This does not mean the memory is false. It means that human memory often turns extended loss into a shape that can be carried. The ancient texts that speak of great floods may not directly preserve these coastal changes in a simple line. Many of them belong to river civilizations, religious traditions, and literary cultures with their own histories. But the broader human background remains important. Across many regions, people lived on low ground because low ground was useful. It was close to water, food, travel, fertile soil, and exchange. The same usefulness made it vulnerable. After the Ice Age, when seas rose and waterways adjusted, some rich human landscapes would also have been among the first to change. The beginning of human settlement was therefore never separate from the risk of losing settlement. To live well near water was to accept a bargain no one had written. The place that gives most easily may also be the place that changes first. A community facing such loss might not describe it in the language of sea levels or climate. It might remember that water came farther than before. It might say that the old land went under. It might teach children that the sea had once been elsewhere, that the safe ground was higher, that listening mattered when elders spoke of water. When stories later took sacred form, these memories could join with moral questions, divine warnings, boats, survivors, and new beginnings. The result would not be a clean record of one event, but a layered human response to environmental loss. Drowned coasts and river mouths matter, because they show that water did not need to cover the entire earth to cover an entire known world. For those who lived at the edge, familiar ground could become the deepest kind of evidence, not written at first, not measured, but remembered because the place of origin had moved beyond reach. The rising seas after the Ice Age give us a broader way to think about flood memory, but they do not give us permission to reduce every flood story to one event. That distinction is important. A single explanation can feel comforting because it makes a scattered human record look clean. One disaster, one memory, many retellings. But the real past is usually less tidy. Water changed many landscapes in many ways. Some communities may have faced river floods that came suddenly. Others may have faced storm surges along exposed coasts. Others may have watched low ground become marsh, then open water across generations. Some may have inherited stories from neighbours. Some may have adapted older traditions into new religious language. Some may have remembered local events so deeply that the place of loss became the whole world in the story. None of these paths needs to cancel the others. The safer view is not that every flood text remembers the same disaster, but that many human groups lived with the same kind of vulnerability. They depended on water, settled near water, travelled by water, farmed with water, and feared the moment when water no longer stayed within expected limits. This is where the question returns to the origin of human life in a very practical sense. Human beings did not begin as masters of landscapes. They began as bodies learning how to survive inside them. The first long memory of our species was not written in books. It was written in repeated movement, where to find water, where to avoid deep mud, where animals gathered, where higher ground could be reached, where the shoreline had changed, where the old camp no longer stood. A community that lived through loss did not need to explain it with modern science to preserve something true about it. They could remember that water had taken ground. They could remember that the old place was no longer safe. They could remember that the young should listen when the elders spoke of the low land. Across time, those memories could become stories of warning, boats, chosen survivors, mountains, animals, and new beginnings. The images are larger than daily life, but the fear beneath them is close to the body. It is the fear of losing the place that holds food, shelter, kinship, burial, and direction. If many communities met that fear in different landscapes, it makes sense that their stories might come to resemble one another, not because one wave crossed every shore at once, but because the human situation repeated itself. A river valley can become a world. A coast can become a world. A plain can become a world. When water covers the known paths, the known fields, and the known dead, it does not have to cover the planet to feel complete. For the survivors, the old world has ended at the scale that matters most, the scale of lived memory. This helps explain why flood traditions can feel universal without requiring a universal flood. They may preserve a pattern of experience rather than a single shared incident. The pattern is quiet and severe. People build near water because life draws them there. Water changes. The built world fails. Memory gathers the loss into a form that can be passed on. Some versions become sacred, some become ancestral, some become moral warnings, some become origin stories, some remain attached to particular rivers or lands. The differences are as important as the similarities, because they show real communities shaping inherited fear through their own environments and beliefs. The end of the Ice Age, the movement of seas, and the flooding of lowlands give this pattern a deep environmental background, but not a simple final answer. They remind us that human memory grew on a changing earth. The ground beneath early communities was never guaranteed to remain as it was. Rivers shifted, shores moved, storms came, and the useful places were often the vulnerable places. If ancient texts from different cultures describe water as the force that ends one order and begins another, perhaps they are not all pointing to one forgotten catastrophe. Perhaps they are preserving a more widespread lesson from the beginning of settled human life. Home is precious because it can be lost, and memory becomes sacred when it teaches people how to live after the ground has changed. Archaeology begins where the old stories fall quiet. A text can say that waters rose, that a survivor was warned, that animals were preserved, or that dry land returned. The ground cannot speak in that language. It answers in slower signs. A layer of silt, a buried floor, a wall repaired after damage, a sudden change in settlement, charred material sealed under mud, pottery found above and below an interruption, seeds preserved in wet deposits, or traces of people returning after a place had been disturbed. These signs are valuable because they keep the flood question attached to the earth. They remind us that water did not live only inside imagination. Rivers overflowed, storms pushed water inland, low ground collected sediment. Villages and towns were sometimes broken, buried, abandoned, or rebuilt. But archaeology also teaches restraint. A layer of mud is not automatically the flood of a sacred text. A damaged settlement is not automatically evidence for a disaster shared by all people. Every trace has to be studied in its own place, with its own depth, soil, materials, dating, and relationship to the landscape around it. The same kind of deposit can mean different things depending on whether it formed in a river plain, a marsh, a coastal zone, a collapsed canal system, or a place repeatedly occupied over many generations. This carefulness may feel less dramatic than a single answer, but it is what protects the truth. When archaeologists study ancient flooding, they are not only asking whether water came, they are asking what kind of water, how it moved, when it arrived, how far it spread, and what happened afterward. Did people return quickly? Did they rebuild on the same ground? Did the settlement pattern shift? Did food storage, walls, or burials change? Did the flood layer cover one house, one neighborhood, one town, or a wider region? These questions matter because human life is local before it becomes memory. At the beginning of settled life, people experience danger through specific places. The doorway where water entered, the field that no longer drained, the path to the river, the higher mound where families gathered, the storage pit that failed, the grave that could not be reached. A later story may turn that experience into the image of all land covered by water, but the first evidence may remain small and physical. A thin layer in the earth can hold the trace of a night, a season, or a rebuilding effort that changed a community's sense of safety. Archaeology is strongest when it lets the scale of evidence remain visible. It can show that a flood happened at a site. It can sometimes suggest whether the event was sudden or repeated, local or wider, destructive or part of a normal cycle. It can compare layers across nearby places and ask whether they belong to the same period or to different moments. It can connect environmental change with shifts in housing, food, trade, or population. What it cannot honestly do is turn every flood deposit into one universal catastrophe, simply because later stories sound alike. The earth is uneven. Evidence survives unevenly. Some flooded places leave clear deposits. Others are eroded, rebuilt, buried too deeply, or lost under modern water. Some communities left written texts. Many did not. Some memories entered literature. Others vanished with the voices that carried them. This unevenness is not failure. It is the actual texture of human history. The earliest human communities did not leave the past arranged for us like a finished book. They left traces scattered through soil, bone, tools, houses, hearths, and sediments. To read those traces well, we have to accept that knowledge comes with edges. A flood layer can bring us close to the lived reality behind flood stories: wet ground, damaged homes, interrupted routines, and the need to begin again. Yet it also asks us not to reach beyond what it can show. In that balance, archaeology becomes a quiet guide. It does not close the ancient flood question with one simple verdict. It shows that water truly shaped human settlements, while reminding us that every claim about remembered disaster must begin with place, time, and evidence. A single flood layer can be moving to imagine. It lies between older and younger traces like a pause in human life, a thin silence where water entered the record, but the meaning of that layer depends on where it is found. If mud covers a floor in one ancient town, it may tell us that the town was flooded, or that one neighbourhood stood in the path of water, or that a channel shifted near the settlement. It does not automatically tell us that every nearby town was flooded at the same time. It does not tell us that distant lands, different rivers, or other cultures shared the same event. The earth does not speak in universal claims. It speaks in locations. A flood deposit has a boundary, even when that boundary is hard to see. The work of careful interpretation is to find that boundary before turning evidence into story. This restraint is especially important because ancient texts often speak in total language. A story may say that all land was covered, that all life was threatened, or that the world began again after water. Such language carries emotional and religious force. It may express how complete the disaster felt to those who remembered it. But archaeology asks a different question. What does the physical evidence actually show in this place? A town built on low ground beside a river may preserve a deep layer of flood sediment. A nearby higher mound may show no such break. A city close to an old channel may be damaged, while another settlement in the same broad region continues with little interruption. These differences matter. They prevent us from taking one dramatic trace and making it carry more weight than it can bear. At the beginning of settled human life, disaster was experienced from the ground up. A flood that destroyed one village could become the most important event in that community's memory, even if people beyond the river bend lived through the same season without knowing. Human worlds were smaller than modern maps. A valley, a plain, a city, a network of fields, or a coast could be the whole meaningful world for the people who depended on it. When that world flooded, the story might later grow to the scale of everything because everything that mattered had been touched. Archaeology helps us respect that feeling without confusing it with global measurement. It lets local suffering remain serious while also keeping the scale honest. This is not a cold reduction of ancient memory. It is a way of protecting it from being used carelessly. If every mud layer becomes proof of one worldwide flood, then the real histories of real communities disappear into a single claim. The damaged house, the rebuilt wall, the abandoned field, the people who returned, and the people who moved away all lose their local meaning. The human origin of flood stories becomes flatter, not deeper. The more careful view allows many histories to remain visible. One river may flood often, another may change course. A coastal storm may leave one kind of trace. A long rise in water may leave another. A canal system may fail. A marsh may expand. A settlement may be rebuilt so many times that the evidence becomes difficult to separate. Each case can contribute to the larger human question without becoming the whole answer. Ancient people did not live inside one shared disaster map. They lived inside particular places with particular risks, and those places shaped their memory. This is why a local flood can be historically real, emotionally immense, and still not evidence for a flood that covered the whole earth. The distinction matters because truth in history often depends on scale. A small event is not small to the people who endure it. A regional disaster is not false because it was not universal. A sacred story is not empty because archaeology cannot confirm every image it contains. The careful listener can hold all of these thoughts together. A flood layer in one city may be a trace of genuine fear, loss, and rebuilding. It may help explain why water became so powerful in human tradition, but it cannot stand alone as the memory of everyone. The ground asks us to listen closely and to let each place keep its own voice. The value of archaeology is not only that it gives answers, its deeper value is that it teaches where answers must stop. This is especially important with ancient flood traditions, because water stories can easily pull the mind toward a single dramatic solution. A text speaks of a world covered. A layer of mud appears in the ground. A familiar motif appears in another culture. The temptation is to join them quickly and say that the mystery has been solved, but careful knowledge moves with less certainty. A deposit in the earth can show that water entered a place. It can show damage, interruption, rebuilding, or abandonment. It can sometimes be dated and compared with nearby evidence, yet it cannot automatically explain every later story, every sacred image, or every memory preserved across distant cultures. The strength of science lies in making that boundary clear. It protects the past from being turned into a simple claim before the evidence is strong enough to carry it. This restraint is not weakness. It is a form of respect for the people who lived through real events. If a flood damaged an ancient settlement, that event mattered on its own terms. The people who faced it did not need it to be worldwide for it to be terrifying. They needed dry ground, food, shelter, animals, family, fire, tools, and a future. When those things were threatened, the disaster entered the body before it entered writing. At the beginning of human life in settled places, survival depended on reading the land correctly. People learned which ground stayed firm, which low places filled, which riverbanks were uncertain, and which routes remained safe after rain. Archaeology may find only the silent remainder of that learning. A floor sealed by sediment, a house rebuilt higher, a shift in where people lived, or a break in ordinary activity. These traces do not speak loudly, but they keep memory connected to real human vulnerability. They show that flood stories did not grow in a world free from floods. They grew in landscapes where water had already shaped survival, fear, and return. At the same time, the limits of evidence prevent false certainty. A scholar may compare ancient texts, sediment layers, river behavior, climate records, and settlement patterns, but each kind of evidence has its own scale. A text may preserve meaning better than measurement. A sediment layer may preserve physical event better than emotion. A myth may carry cultural memory, moral reflection, and older environmental fear together. None of these should be forced to replace the others. When they are placed side by side, they create a more honest picture, not a finished proof of one disaster remembered by all humanity, but a complex record of how people lived with water as both necessity and danger. This kind of honesty matters for the central question. The ancient texts that describe similar floods are not meaningless, because archaeology cannot confirm one global event. They are also not automatically literal history, because some places show signs of flooding. The truth may be more layered. Many communities may have experienced destructive water in different ways. Some memories may have travelled through contact between cultures. Some stories may have been reshaped by religion, ritual, and moral teaching. Some images may have arisen independently because human bodies face the same basic problem when water removes ground. The careful listener does not need to choose between blind belief and empty dismissal. A slower path remains open. Listen to the text as memory, listen to the ground as evidence, and let each speak within its proper limits. This brings the flood question back to the oldest human condition. People became human by learning to remember what the environment could do. They carried warnings before there were archives. They turned danger into teaching before there were formal histories. A flood that once covered a field, a village, or a valley could become part of how later generations understood the fragility of home. Archaeology can help us see the physical shadow of such events, but it also reminds us that not every shadow belongs to the same storm. The most useful knowledge is not the most dramatic knowledge. It is the knowledge that can say, calmly, water came here, people suffered here, memory may have grown here, and beyond that point, we must continue carefully. The likeness among flood stories becomes easier to understand when we return to one plain fact. Human beings need water so deeply that they have always been drawn toward it. A dry hill may be safer from rising rivers, but it may not feed a family. A distant upland may remain above storms, but it may lack fish, reeds, soft soil, drinking water, and easy movement. Again and again, human groups found themselves pulled toward riverbanks, lake shores, marsh edges, deltas, and coasts, because those places offered life in concentrated form. Water gathered animals. Water fed plants. Water softened soil for planting. Water carried boats, goods, stories, and people. A place close to water could become a place of return, and return is one of the quiet beginnings of home. But the same attraction carried risk. The useful bank could collapse. The fertile plain could fill. The path beside the river could vanish. The shore that gave food could receive storms from beyond sight. This is not a rare contradiction. It is one of the oldest bargains in human history. The places that help people live are often the places that can change most quickly. Flood stories, in many traditions, may grow from that bargain. They do not need identical origins to share a similar shape, because the human situation was often similar. People built memory beside water because they had to live beside water, and they feared water because they had already learned how much of life depended on the ground remaining dry enough to hold them. At the beginning of human settlement, this dependence was not theoretical. It was felt in the body every day. A child drinking from a river, an elder watching cloud and current, a family storing grain near a house of mud brick, a group cutting reeds near a marsh, a fisher returning before dark. All of these ordinary actions tied survival to a changing element. The danger did not always arrive as a great wall of water. Sometimes it came through heavy rain, a swollen river, a storm tide, a failed bank, a blocked channel, or a season that behaved differently from memory. Yet when it came, it touched the same core needs: warmth, food, shelter, kinship, burial, and direction. If these needs are shared by human bodies everywhere, then stories about their collapse may also begin to resemble one another. The warning before the flood, the search for higher ground, the saving of animals or seeds, the protected vessel, the return of land, and the new beginning are not random decorations. They answer basic problems created when water crosses the line between help and danger. What should be carried? Who should be believed? Where can life wait while the land is hidden? How can a community step back into the world after the water withdraws? These questions belong to river valleys in one region, but they can also belong to monsoon plains, coastal inlets, island shores, and low agricultural lands elsewhere. The old texts and traditions may differ because each culture explained the crisis through its own beliefs, but the pressure beneath them was widely human. The origin of the pattern may not be one forgotten flood, but repeated contact between vulnerable bodies and unstable water. That idea does not reduce the stories. It gives them a slower kind of depth. It suggests that ancient flood memory may be rooted in the daily geography of survival, where water was both the source of food and the force that could remove the place of food. People did not have to know one another to fear the same reversal. They only had to live where water gave enough to make staying possible, and enough danger to make remembering necessary. That is why similar flood stories can arise across distance without becoming proof of one shared disaster. Agriculture made the bond between people and water even more intense. A group that gathers food from many places can move when one place becomes difficult, but a farming community invests hope into a field, a season, and an expectation of rain or river flow. Seed goes into the ground before the harvest is certain. Labor is spent before the result is visible. Houses, storage pits, canals, and family routines gather around the same soil. Water becomes the hidden promise beneath all of it. Too little water means hunger. Too much water means loss. The same river that leaves fertile sediment can drown young plants, rot stored grain, weaken walls, and carry away the work of many hands. This is why flood memory could become especially powerful in societies that depended on crops. A flood was not only a danger to the body in the moment, it was a danger to the future, because it could erase the food that had not yet become food. It could break the bridge between one season and the next. At the beginning of settled human life, that bridge was everything. People were learning to bind survival to cycles larger than a single day. Rain, planting, ripening, storage, birth, dry season, return. A flood could break that rhythm and make time itself feel unreliable. The old stories that speak of water ending a world may preserve this deeper fear, not simply that people might die, but that the pattern by which life continued might fail. Agricultural landscapes also made water social and moral. When many families depend on the same river, canal, or low plain, water is no longer only a private need. It becomes tied to labour, authority, obligation, and dispute. Who opens a channel? Who repairs a bank? Who stores grain? Who receives help if the lower fields are ruined? Who is blamed if warning signs are ignored? These questions show why flood stories often become stories about order. In many ancient traditions, the flood arrives after disorder, violence, neglect, arrogance, or a failure to listen. A modern reader does not have to treat that as a direct explanation of weather. It may be better understood as the way societies placed environmental danger inside the language of responsibility. Water was natural, but its damage exposed the human arrangement around it. A flood could reveal whether a community had prepared, whether people trusted old warnings, and whether stored resources could carry survivors through. Here again, the origin of the flood image lies close to the origin of human social life. People survived by coordinating memory, food, work, and care across generations. Water helped create that coordination, then threatened to break it. This double role helps explain why flood motifs can appear similar across cultures that were not identical. Farming communities in different lands may have faced different rivers, rains, soils, and calendars, yet the emotional problem could resemble itself. The field must wait for water, but not too much. The village must be near the field, but not too low. The storage must be close enough to use, but safe enough to survive. Elders may remember old danger while the young trust the present season too easily. When floodwater crosses the field, it does not only cover plants, it covers planning, it covers confidence. It reminds people that the human future depends on forces no community fully commands. Ancient texts could turn that reminder into sacred drama, with warnings, vessels, survivors, and renewed promises. Oral traditions could turn it into ancestral instruction. Local memory could turn it into a rule about where not to build or when to leave. The similarity of these stories, then, may come from the shared structure of agricultural life itself. Human beings learned to make water serve life, but never completely removed its power to undo life. The river could feed a civilization and frighten it in the same season. The rain could bless a field and bury it in mud. The flood could be remembered as punishment, warning, cleansing, or beginning again, because it touched the deepest dependency of settled people, the hope that the land will answer human labor with another harvest. The same flood shapes can appear in distant traditions because the human body meets water in similar ways. A person standing before rising water does not first think in literary patterns. The body feels cold, weight, wet clothing, unstable footing, the need to lift a child, the fear of losing food, and the sudden importance of higher ground. These sensations are older than writing and older than formal religion. They belong to the long beginning of our species, when survival depended on reading landscapes correctly and remembering danger before it returned. A river valley in one region and a coastal plain in another may differ in language, gods, crops, and tools, yet the body placed inside flood danger confronts the same basic questions. Where is dry ground? What can be carried? Who is missing? What must be left behind? How long can life wait before the land becomes usable again? Because the questions are similar. The stories that grow around them can take related forms without needing one single source. A warning appears because danger is easier to survive if someone notices it early. A vessel appears because life needs a boundary when the outer world has lost its boundaries. Animals appear because human life is not separate from the living world around it. A mountain or high place appears because the body understands height as safety. Dry land returns because no human community can continue as a community without a place to stand, cook, sleep, bury, plant, and remember. These motifs do not belong only to one culture. They answer practical and emotional needs created when water crosses its normal place. That is why resemblance among flood traditions can be meaningful without becoming absolute proof of one remembered event. The resemblance may show that human beings, in many environments, shaped fear into a small set of images strong enough to survive retelling. Environment is one layer of that resemblance. Bodies are another. Archaeological traces are another. Population and generations add still another. A flood that one group survives can become the story an elder tells to children who never saw the water. Those children may grow up in a safer season, but the warning remains inside the community. Later, after movement, marriage, trade, or migration, the story may enter new lands and meet new experiences. It may merge with another memory of water. It may be placed inside a new religious frame. It may become less exact as history and more powerful as instruction. In that way, the story changes because human generations change, not because memory has no value. Memory is alive because it is carried by living people. Each generation asks the old story to serve the dangers it understands. The beginning of human culture was built on this kind of transfer, one life passing a pattern to another life so that the same loss would not have to be learned from the beginning again. The shared flood motifs therefore point toward a deep human structure rather than a simple final answer. People everywhere need water, but cannot fully command it. People everywhere need ground, but often choose the low and fertile places because they make food possible. People everywhere protect children, animals, tools, names, and the dead because a community is made from more than bodies breathing at the same time. When water threatens these things, the mind searches for images that can hold the threat. The boat holds life. The warning holds memory. The high place holds hope. The returning land holds the possibility that order can be rebuilt. Different cultures gave these images different meanings, and those differences matter. Yet beneath them is a shared human fact. The same element that helped people settle into history also reminded them that settlement was never guaranteed. Water was both path and border, food and fear, origin and erasure. That double meaning could arise wherever human beings learned to make a home beside an element that would never fully belong to them. Before flood stories were written, they lived in voices. A memory did not need ink, clay, or carved marks to survive. It could live in the way an elder spoke near a fire, in the pause before naming a drowned place, in a warning repeated when children walked too close to low ground, or in a ritual that returned each year when the dangerous season approached. Long before a scribe fixed a flood account into lasting words, people had already learned that spoken memory could protect life. A story told at the right time might keep a family from sleeping too near the river. A tale of water reaching the old trees might teach the young where safety ended. A remembered loss might become a rule. Do not trust the plain when the rain has been long. Do not ignore the changing current. Do not forget that the sea was once farther away. In the beginning of human culture, this kind of memory was not entertainment. It was a way of keeping experience alive after the bodies that suffered it were gone. Oral tradition works differently from writing. Writing can preserve a phrase with unusual stability, but spoken memory preserves what a community continues to need. A detail that no longer matters may fade, a detail tied to danger may remain, the exact height of the flood may be forgotten, while the warning to move upward remains strong. The exact number of days may change, while the image of waiting for dry land stays clear. The name of the first witness may disappear, while the lesson survives in the figure of a careful survivor, a foolish crowd, a protected family, or a sacred sign. This does not mean oral memory is useless. It means oral memory is shaped by repetition, emotion, social need, and the limits of human recall. A flood that once broke houses and fields could become, after generations, a story that explains why a people respects certain places, avoids certain seasons, or believes that life once passed through water before beginning again. Family was one of the first homes of such memory. Children learned the world through the voices of adults long before they could read signs in the land for themselves. They were told where animals crossed, where plants grew, where water could be drunk, where mud was deep, and where ancestors once lived. The origin of human knowledge was often intimate. A hand pointing, a voice lowering, a place named with care. When a flood memory passed through families, it carried more than information. It carried grief, identity, and belonging. To say that water once took the old ground was also to say that the people now living had come through loss. It gave the living a place in a chain of survival. They were not the first to fear water, and they were not the first to begin again after it. Ritual could strengthen the same memory. A community might gather, recite, offer, mourn, or retell, not because every listener needed a practical warning that day, but because repeated remembrance helped bind the group together. Disaster becomes less lonely when it is shared in a pattern. A flood that once scattered people can later become a story that gathers them. Over time, such stories may move from household speech into public telling, from public telling into sacred tradition, and from sacred tradition into written text. By the time writing appears, the story may already be old. It may carry traces of storms, rivers, vanished shores, moral teaching, borrowed motifs, and local memory layered together. That is why ancient flood texts should be heard as late forms of older human remembering. They are not merely invented when they are written down. They often stand at the end of a long passage from experience to voice, from voice to tradition, and from tradition to text. Before the tablet, there was the mouth. Before the manuscript, there was the remembered path to higher ground. When a flood story enters writing, it gains a different kind of life. The voice that once depended on a speaker and a listener becomes a form that can be copied, studied, recited, and carried beyond the first community that shaped it. But writing does not make the story simple. A memory that may have begun with water in a particular landscape can become a teaching about order, ancestry, justice, divine power, human limits, or the beginning of a people. The flood is no longer only remembered as something that happened. It becomes a way of explaining how the present world came to be, why certain rules matter, why promises are sacred, or why human life must remain humble before forces larger than itself. This is one reason ancient flood texts feel weighty. They are not merely accounts of wet ground, they are cultural vessels holding environment, fear, belief, and identity together. To write a flood story down is to give disaster a place inside a larger pattern. The event, whether local, regional, inherited, or symbolic, is no longer only an interruption, it becomes part of a beginning. A people can look back and say that after water, there was a new order, a new ancestor, a new covenant, a renewed duty, or a warning that must never be forgotten. This movement from disaster to origin reaches deep into the human past. Early communities did not only need to survive events, they needed to explain survival to those born later. A child born after a flood sees the rebuilt houses, the changed fields, the older people who still remember, and the rules that seem to surround certain places. Writing can gather all of that into a stable form. It tells later generations that their world is not accidental. It has passed through danger. It carries a memory of being nearly lost. In many ancient cultures, origins were not described as calm beginnings. They were often described as beginnings after separation, struggle, darkness, wandering, or water. The flood fits this pattern because water can erase older marks and make the return of dry land feel like creation again. After the waters recede, the world appears, not because it is new in a geological sense, but because it has become livable again. The first step onto dry ground becomes an image of human re-entry into order. Fire can return, food can be prepared, animals can scatter into their places, family lines can continue, speech can name the land again. The written story preserves this feeling and gives it public meaning. It allows the flood to become part of law, ritual, genealogy, prayer, poetry, or royal memory. That transformation also changes how the story is heard. A spoken warning may say, "Remember where the water rose." A written tradition may say, "Remember what kind of world humans live in." It may teach that life is fragile, that power has limits, that moral disorder has consequences, or that mercy can survive judgment. These meanings do not require every detail to function as modern historical reporting. They show how ancient societies used inherited memories to think about existence. The origin of the human story is not only biological, not only the movement of bodies through landscapes, it is also the slow formation of shared meanings that help a group endure loss without losing itself. When flood memory becomes writing, the disaster becomes a mirror. A community looks into it and sees more than water. It sees its dependence on land, animals, ancestors, children, law, and hope. It sees that a home can be destroyed, yet a story can carry the shape of home forward. That is why these ancient texts remain important for the larger question. They may not give a direct answer to whether everyone remembered one disaster, but they show how many peoples turned water into a language of origin and order. What remains inside an ancient flood text is rarely a clean picture of the original event. It is more like a shoreline seen after mist has settled over it. Shapes are still there, but they are softened by distance, belief, grief, and repeated telling. A flood may have happened in one valley, along one river, near one coast, or across a low plain where people once lived. It may have been remembered for generations before words fixed it into a durable form. By the time the story becomes text, the first water has long withdrawn. The houses may be gone, the witnesses may be gone, the exact place may no longer be named in the same way. Yet something survives, not a perfect record, but a pattern of human attention. The story remembers that water crossed a boundary, that ordinary trust failed, that life had to be protected, and that the world after disaster needed explanation. This is why ancient flood accounts should be heard as traces of remembering, not as photographs of the past. They show what people chose to preserve after time had already changed the event. They show that memory is not only about keeping facts, it is also about keeping meaning alive. From the beginning of human life, remembering was tied to survival. A body that remembers danger may live through the next season. A family that remembers where water rose may choose higher ground. A community that remembers the loss of food, animals, tools, and graves may teach its children to read the land more carefully. When flood memory enters story, it carries this old practical knowledge into a wider emotional and moral world. It says that ground is precious because it can be lost. It says that water is generous, but not obedient. It says that survival is not the same as forgetting. The written text becomes a shelter for what no longer exists in its first form. A drowned field cannot speak. A ruined house cannot tell its own story. The people who fled may leave no names behind. But a tradition can carry the shape of their fear and the discipline of their warning. This is why the question of one disaster remains open and difficult. The texts may contain echoes of real floods, but they also contain the work of generations trying to make disaster understandable. They may preserve contact between cultures, borrowed motifs, sacred teaching, and local experience woven together. Their strength does not depend on proving that every culture saw the same water. Their strength lies in showing that many cultures understood water as a test of memory itself. Could a people remember the right things after loss? Could they carry life forward without losing the lesson of vulnerability? Could they turn terror into instruction instead of silence? These questions reach back to the oldest human situation, a small group living within a large environment, never fully protected, never fully separate from the forces that fed it. At that scale, a remembered flood is not only a past event, it is a rehearsal of attention. It teaches later generations to imagine the ground beneath them as living, changing, and not entirely promised. It asks them to notice rivers, shores, rain, storage, shelter, and the quiet warnings held in older voices. Ancient flood texts are therefore not only about what water did, they are about what human beings did afterward. They spoke, repeated, reshaped, wrote, copied, recited, believed, questioned, and handed on. What survived was not the flood itself, but the memory of being changed by water. That may be the deepest link among these traditions. Not one certain catastrophe behind every text, and not empty invention either, but a human habit born from need, to keep the trace of danger alive long enough for those who sleep on later ground to understand that home has always been quietly fragile. By now the question can be held in two careful hands. One hand holds the possibility that some flood stories may carry echoes of a very old shared memory, perhaps shaped by contact among neighbouring cultures, perhaps deepened by real floods in river plains, perhaps carried by movement, trade, exile, or the long life of oral tradition. The other hand holds a different possibility, that many communities, living in different lands, faced different waters, and later gave those experiences similar shapes because human need and human fear were similar. These ideas do not have to destroy each other. They may both be present in the long history of flood memory. Some texts may be historically related. Some images may have travelled from one culture to another. Some local disasters may have become sacred stories. Some similar motifs may have appeared independently because the same danger asked the same questions. Ancient memory rarely leaves a single straight road back to its beginning. It leaves voices, layers, borrowings, silences, and landscapes changed by time. A single disaster explanation is powerful because it feels clean. It gives the listener one hidden event behind many traditions, one great water, one wound in human memory, one catastrophe remembered in different tongues. That idea should not be mocked, because human cultures do share stories, and large environmental events can leave deep marks, but it should not be turned into a settled conclusion without evidence strong enough to support it. Ancient texts do not become geological records simply because they describe water. Similar symbols do not become proof merely because they resemble one another. The beginning of human life teaches a slower lesson. Early communities did not live in one shared archive. They lived near rivers, shores, marshes, deltas, lakes, and low plains. Each place had its own dangers, and each danger could become central to the people who survived it. A valley flood could be remembered as the ending of the known world. A coastal loss could become a story of land taken by water. A storm could compress fear into one unforgettable night. A river changing course could erase fields and make old paths meaningless. The event might be local in physical scale, but total in human scale. For people whose whole life was organized around one landscape, losing that landscape was not small. It was the loss of orientation, food, shelter, graves, and future. This is why the many disaster explanation has its own strength. It does not require every culture to remember the same water. It asks us to notice how often people lived close to water, and how often water could cross the line between gift and threat. It allows flood stories to be different without becoming unrelated. A boat in one tradition, high ground in another, a warned survivor in another, and a renewed world in another, may all answer the same human problem. How does life continue when the place of life fails? Contact between cultures must also remain in the picture. Stories can travel farther than floods. A motif born beside one river can be retold beside another. A sacred account can reshape older images. A scribe can inherit a tradition and give it a new meaning. A people displaced from one land can carry memories into another. Human history is made of such crossings. The origin of flood tradition, therefore, may not be one source or many sources alone, but a layered movement between experience and transmission. Real water damaged real places. Human bodies remembered cold, hunger, fear, and rescue. Families turned memory into warning. Communities turned warning into story. Text turned story into durable meaning. The central question remains open because the evidence asks for humility. Did everyone remember one disaster, or did many peoples remember the same kind of disaster in ways that slowly came to resemble one another? The safest answer is not a final claim, but a careful frame. Ancient flood texts preserve a shared human encounter with vulnerable ground, whether that encounter came through one remembered event, many local events, or both. A balanced answer is harder to hold than a dramatic one, but it is more faithful to the evidence. It would be too simple to say that all ancient flood traditions are only imagination, because people in many regions lived with destructive water. Rivers overflowed, storms broke coasts, channels shifted, lowlands drowned, and settlements were interrupted. It would also be too simple to say that all these traditions must come from one single catastrophe remembered by everyone. The past does not give that conclusion so easily. What it gives instead is a mixture of real landscapes, real losses, stories, religious meanings, and the long human habit of turning danger into memory. The wiser question is not how to make every text fit one answer, but how to let different kinds of evidence keep their proper weight. A written story can reveal what a culture feared and valued. A flood deposit can show that water once entered a particular place. A shared motif can suggest contact, inheritance, or repeated human experience. None of these speaks for the whole past alone. Together, they form a quieter picture in which possibility remains open, but certainty is earned slowly. Large floods did happen in human history, and some were powerful enough to reshape communities. A river flood in a low plain could destroy stored food, damage houses, scatter animals, and force rebuilding. A coastal storm could push water across land where people had walked for generations. Sea level rise after the Ice Age could move the edge of the known world and leave older places beneath water. These events were not small to the people who endured them. They could become the center of local memory, the kind of memory carried into warnings, rituals, and eventually written traditions. At the beginning of settled life, when people were binding themselves to fields, riverbanks, marshes, and shores, such events would have touched survival at its root. A flood could threaten not only the present body, but the stored future, grain, animals, tools, children, graves, and the confidence that tomorrow would take place on recognizable ground. That is why we should not dismiss the possibility that some ancient texts preserve echoes of major environmental trauma. Yet an echo is not the same as a complete recording. Memory changes as it travels. A local disaster can become a world disaster in language, because the local world was the world that mattered to the survivors. A practical warning can become sacred teaching, A story inherited from neighbours can be reshaped inside a new tradition. A real flood can be remembered through symbols that speak more about meaning than measurement. This is not deception. It is how human memory often works when it carries pain through time. The careful listener can allow for real events behind some flood stories without saying that the events were all the same event. That distinction protects both history and memory. It leaves room for Mesopotamian river floods, for Near Eastern literary influence, for coastal loss after changing seas, for independent traditions in water-shaped landscapes, and for the moral imagination of communities that saw disaster as more than weather. The origin of the flood pattern may therefore be plural. It may have many roots feeding one recognizable image: water rising beyond trust, life gathered into a remnant, dry ground returning, and people trying to understand why survival continued. This plural view may feel less dramatic, but it is more human. It fits the way people actually live, remember, borrow, adapt, and teach. It also keeps the central question alive without turning mystery into exaggeration. Ancient flood texts do not force us to deny large disasters, and they do not allow us to announce one universal flood as settled fact. They ask for a slower honesty. Something happened often enough, deeply enough, and meaningfully enough that water became one of humanity's oldest languages for loss and renewal. The question in the title may seem to ask for one hidden event, but it also asks something quieter. Why did water become the kind of memory that different peoples could place at the edge of a world? A flood is not the only disaster humans have known. Fire burns settlements. Drought empties fields. Earthquakes break walls. Disease removes voices from houses. Yet flood stories carry a distinct shape because water changes the basic grammar of human life. It does not only destroy an object, it covers the surface on which objects, paths, homes, animals, bodies, and boundaries are arranged. It turns the known land into an unknown surface. A person can still see the sky, but the ground has become uncertain. That reversal may be why many ancient texts used floodwater to imagine an ending that is not only death, but unmaking. The world remains visible and yet becomes unusable. To a community living close to rivers, shores, marshes, or low fields, that image would not need to be invented from nothing. It would grow from the physical knowledge that life depends on land and water staying in a delicate relationship. The deeper question, then, is not only whether everyone remembered one disaster, it is why the memory of water could travel so easily into sacred story, moral warning, and accounts of renewal. The answer begins with the early human need to join memory to place. People did not survive by thinking of landscape as background. They survived by knowing where to drink, where to plant, where animals moved, where higher ground waited, where a channel could shift, where old watermarks stood, and where the elders said the land had once failed. That knowledge was practical, but it also became emotional. A riverbank is not just a resource after generations have lived beside it. It becomes a place of birth, work, grief, return, burial, and identity. When water covers such a place, it threatens more than the body. It threatens the story by which people know who they are. This is why a local flood can grow in memory, until it carries the feeling of a whole world lost. The size of the event on a map may be smaller than the size of the event inside the community. Ancient flood traditions may therefore be less about the measurement of water and more about the human scale of loss. They ask how life continues after the familiar world has been made strange. They ask what must be carried forward when ordinary trust fails. They ask why some memory survives when houses, fields, and names disappear. Those questions could arise from a single powerful flood in one region. They could also arise many times in many places, then meet one another through travel, trade, conquest, writing, and shared religious imagination. The old texts may preserve both paths, inherited stories shaped by contact and independent responses shaped by similar environments. A truthful reading allows this layered possibility to remain. It does not flatten every tradition into the same event, and it does not separate them so completely that their shared human depth is lost. This is where the flood story becomes a mirror for the beginning of civilization itself. Settled life was an act of trust. People trusted that fields would answer labour, that rivers would remain within some expected pattern. that stored food would bridge seasons, that houses would still stand when children woke, and that the dead would remain in places where memory could return to them. Water could nourish that trust, and water could break it. When ancient texts describe the flood as a boundary between an old world and a renewed one, they may be preserving the shock of seeing trust broken and then slowly rebuilt. The important question may not be simply which flood was first. It may be why human beings, from the earliest settlements onward, kept finding in floodwater the same severe lesson. The place that gives life is never fully under human command, and memory becomes necessary because home is never guaranteed. Ancient flood stories leave us with a calm and difficult lesson. Civilization is never separate from the environment that supports it. A city may have walls, names, laws, markets, temples, boats, fields, and written records, but beneath all of that remains a simpler dependence. People need water, soil, food, shelter, and stable ground. The old texts remind us that human achievement grows out of this dependence, not beyond it. A village near a river can become a town can become a kingdom can leave tablets, poems, genealogies, and sacred traditions. Yet the river is still there, not as decoration but as one of the conditions that made the whole structure possible. When water rises beyond trust, it exposes how much of human order rests on a relationship with land that must be renewed again and again. This is why flood stories are not only stories about destruction, they are stories about the fragile agreement between people and place. From the beginning of human life in settled communities, people lived by learning where the world could be generous and where it could become dangerous. They did not build history on empty ground. They built beside rivers that could shift, coasts that could move, plains that could flood, and fields that required careful timing. The earliest homes, storage places, paths, and graves were all placed inside landscapes that had their own rhythms. When those rhythms changed, the human world changed with them. A flood could reveal, in one severe moment, what everyday life often hides, that food, shelter, memory, and identity depend on conditions no community fully controls. The lesson is not that people were helpless. Ancient societies were often remarkably observant and adaptive. They watched seasons, built canals, raised houses, chose higher ground, stored food, moved animals, and passed warnings through voice and ritual. But adaptation is not the same as mastery. The flood image endures because it shows the limit of planning. It says that even a carefully built world remains vulnerable when the forces beneath it shift. This has educational value today, not because the old stories give us a simple scientific model of the past, but because they train humility. They ask us to see human history as a long conversation with water, climate, soil, and time. They ask us to recognize that memory is part of survival. A society that remembers only its victories may forget the conditions that allowed those victories to happen. A society that remembers disaster carefully may learn to live with more attention. Ancient flood texts also teach that loss can become instruction without becoming exaggeration. Their truth is not always the truth of measurement. It may be the truth of dependence, warning, and renewal. When they speak of a world covered by water, they may be holding the feeling of people whose own world was covered. When they speak of survivors, they may be asking what must be preserved when ordinary life fails. When they speak of dry land returning, they may be describing the slow recovery of trust. This does not answer every historical question, and it should not. The value of these stories is partly that they keep the question open while grounding it in human experience. They remind us that the past was lived by bodies on real ground, not by ideas floating above the earth. Every ancient settlement, however grand in memory, began as a place where people hoped the ground would hold, the water would feed, and the next generation would wake to a world still livable. Flood stories preserve the moment when that hope was shaken. They teach that civilization is precious not because it is permanent, but because it is built by fragile beings who keep learning how to begin again, carrying memory as carefully as food, fire, and the small trust that tomorrow may still have solid ground beneath it. The most useful gift from ancient flood stories is not fear. Fear can wake the body, but it cannot teach for long unless it becomes attention. The old texts ask for a slower response. They ask listeners to notice how deeply human life depends on forces that are ordinary until they are not. Rain, river, soil, season, shoreline, and the quiet stability of ground. A person may live for years beside water and think of it only as comfort, food, cleaning, travel, and beauty. Then one season, one storm, or one gradual change can reveal that water also belongs to a larger system no household controls. Ancient people knew this without satellites, instruments, or modern climate science. They knew it through paths that vanished, fields that failed, houses that had to be raised, and stories told to children so the next generation would not begin from ignorance. The educational value of these flood traditions begins there. They show that wisdom is not the same as certainty. A community can know enough to survive, yet never know everything. It can prepare, remember, build, move, plant, pray, write, and still remain exposed to changes larger than its plans. That does not make human effort meaningless. It makes effort more humble. From the origin of settled life, people had to learn this balance. They were not simply victims of nature, and they were not rulers standing outside it. They were living bodies inside a living environment, trying to make a home where food could grow, children could sleep, animals could be kept, and the dead could be remembered. Flood stories preserve the pressure of that balance. They say that the human world is made by hands, but it is held inside conditions those hands did not create. For a modern listener, this is still worth hearing, even when the ancient details remain uncertain. The question is not whether every image in every flood text can be measured like a river gauge. The question is what kind of attention these stories cultivate. They encourage respect for evidence, because memory can change and claims can grow beyond what the ground can show. They encourage respect for tradition, because stories can preserve real human experience even when they do not behave like scientific reports. They encourage patience with uncertainty, because the past often arrives through fragments. A text copied long after older voices, a layer of mud in one place, a motif shared across cultures, a coastline now under water, a name whose first meaning has been lost. To learn from such fragments is to avoid two easy mistakes. One mistake is to turn every flood story into proof of one dramatic event. The other is to dismiss every story because it cannot answer modern questions in modern language. A calmer path lies between them. It allows memory, evidence, environment, and belief to stand together without being confused for one another. That kind of thinking is useful far beyond ancient history. It teaches that truth often has layers, and that careful limits can make a story more trustworthy, not less meaningful. The old flood texts also remind us that human beings survive by carrying lessons forward. Every generation receives a world shaped by choices, losses, and warnings it did not personally witness. The first people who told of dangerous water were not only describing what frightened them, they were giving the future a way to listen. They were saying, in the language available to them, do not forget that the ground beneath home has a history. Do not forget that safety is built from memory as well as stone, wood, clay, law, and labour. Do not forget that after disaster, rebuilding without learning is only another kind of forgetting. Heard this way, the ancient flood stories become neither sensational secrets nor outdated tales. They become quiet teachers. They ask human beings to live with gratitude for water, caution before water, and humility before the limits of what any age can claim to know. At the end of these flood traditions, the strongest message is not that all ancient peoples must have remembered one exact disaster. The stronger message is that human beings kept returning to water because water revealed something basic about life. It showed that a home is not only a building. A home is a relationship between bodies, ground, food, memory, animals, weather, and time. When that relationship holds, people may forget how fragile it is. They plant, store, walk, sleep, name places, bury the dead, and imagine that the world beneath them will remain patient. When water crosses the boundary, the hidden dependence becomes visible. The field was never separate from the river. The house was never separate from the soil. The story was never separate from the people who needed to remember why the low ground mattered. This is why ancient flood texts still speak with quiet force. They do not only describe the fear of water, they describe the human need to make meaning after the familiar world changes. Across Mesopotamia, the Hebrew tradition, Greek memory, Indian tradition, and many other cultural settings, flood stories ask what survives when ordinary order fails. Sometimes the answer is a family, sometimes it is animals, sometimes it is a covenant, a warning, a new ancestor, a moral lesson, or the return of dry land. Beneath these forms is a deeper continuity, people trying to carry life through rupture. That task reaches back toward the beginning of human culture. Long before cities became powerful and texts became sacred, human groups survived by remembering. They remembered where water could be found, where water had risen, where the ground stayed firm, where storms had reached, and where an older generation said a lost place once stood. Memory was not decoration, it was part of shelter. It helped people sleep on land that had once frightened their ancestors. The ancient flood stories may therefore be read as careful reminders of humility. They do not give us permission to claim more than the evidence can support. They do not require us to flatten many traditions into one single event. They also do not ask us to dismiss old stories as meaningless simply because they speak in sacred or symbolic language. A truthful reading can hold several things together. Real floods happened, sea levels changed, river landscapes were dangerous, stories travelled, cultures borrowed from one another, and human beings often shaped similar fears into similar images. The mystery remains because the past is layered. It is made of earth, water, language, loss, belief, and time. What we can learn from it is not only about ancient disaster, it is about the way human beings learn to live with uncertainty. A civilization becomes wiser not when it pretends the ground is permanent, but when it remembers that stability is a gift that must be cared for. A person becomes wiser not by fearing every storm, but by listening to the quiet knowledge carried by those who came before. The old flood texts preserve that knowledge in the form their worlds understood. They tell us that survival is more than escaping danger. It is the patient work of rebuilding without forgetting. It is teaching the young that water gives life, but must be respected. It is recognizing that no age, ancient or modern, stands outside nature. If there is a final value in these stories, it may be this. They invite us to live more carefully on the ground we have been given, knowing that human memory began as a way to protect fragile life from a changing world. And so, when many ancient texts describe water rising, land disappearing, and life beginning again, we are left not with a closed answer, but with a quiet question about what the oldest memory of flood is still asking human beings to understand.